Welcome back to Into the Word and our study on a big picture of the Old Testament. Today we will cover 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You may have heard the quote, "Those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." As we look at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we will see that this was certainly the case for the Israelites back then. In the previous session, I mentioned that 2nd Samuel ended with King David on the throne. In the beginning of 1st Kings, we see that David died and Solomon took his place as king of Israel. Throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, we see Israel under the leadership of various kings. These two books together cover about 400 years in the history of Israel. It starts with Solomon as king of Israel and ends with the destruction of Israel because the Israelites were unable to be faithful to God. The focus of 1st and 2nd Kings is that obedience to God's commands brings blessings, but disobedience to his commands brings failure. For the Israelites, this was directly related to the covenant relationship God had established with Israel. 1st and 2nd Kings evaluates each king. Did the king lead the people in obeying God, or did he lead them into worshiping false idols? The primary concern was the king's faithfulness and obedience to God. The focus is not on his military or economic exploits. Both 1st and 2nd Kings compares the Israelite kings to the good example of King David or to the bad example of King Jeroboam I. As we start reading 1st Kings, we see that the kingdom of Israel was first united under the reign of King Solomon. But then in 1st Kings chapter 12, we see that the kingdom split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. At first, there was enmity between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But this was then followed by a time of peace and friendship. This was then again followed by another time of enmity between the two kingdoms. Towards the end of 2nd Kings, in chapter 18, the only kingdom that remains is the kingdom of Judah. As I just mentioned, in 1st Kings chapter 12, we see that Israel became a divided kingdom. This happened in 930 BC. From then on, the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom kept on being called Israel, and the southern kingdom was then called Judah. Israel, or the northern kingdom, was destroyed in 722 BC. The southern kingdom, or Judah, was destroyed in 587 BC. So when you get to the end of 2nd Kings, the nation of Israel as a nation no longer existed. So that gives us an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings. But we also want to touch on the structure that we find in 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings uses a very specific repetitive structure. This structure includes the following elements. There is an introduction to the king. There is an evaluation of the king. There is a reference to other materials or other sources. And then it closes with a reference to the death and the burial of the king, and a reference to the next king who was to follow. So let's look at an example from 1st Kings chapter 15. In 1st Kings chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, it says, "In the 18th year of the reign of King Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became the king of Judah. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother's name was Micah, daughter of Abishalom." So you see the reference to the 18th year of Jeroboam. So once we get to 1st Kings chapter 12, like I just mentioned, there are two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Of course, back then they didn't have a calendar, so what they did was they referred to the reign of the king in the other kingdom to create a time reference. Then we get to the evaluation. This is found in verse 3. "He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been." Next, we see the reference to other records. That's in verse 7. "As for the other events of Abijah's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah?" The account then closes with his death and burial and a reference to the next king. Verse 8 says, "And Abijah rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And Asa his son succeeded him as king." One more thing to note in 1st and 2nd Kings is the importance of the prophets, especially Elijah and Elisha. The prophets spoke on behalf of God, and through the prophets, God spoke to the people and demonstrated with power and with miracles that they were to worship him. Now let's look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The majority of the content that we find in 1st and 2nd Chronicles actually comes out of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. The difference is that in Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, the authors included all of the history of Israel. They included the good stuff, the bad stuff, and the ugly stuff. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written after the Babylonian exile, when the people of Israel had returned to Israel. The purpose of the Chronicles was to trace the history of faith and salvation for the Israelites. Chronicles focuses only on the positive and leaves out the negative side of the history of Israel. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written to give the people hope and to remind them that God still loved them and that he still had a covenant relationship with them. Chronicles does this by tracing the line of David, the ancestry of David, and by referring to Jerusalem and the temple. So this brings us to the end of the second session on the historical books. In the next session, the third session on the historical books, we will cover Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.